Faran Thomason. At Nintendo, I worked on Warlock, which was probably the first handheld RTS-style game. It was on the Game Boy Color. The first game I worked on as a producer was called Bubsy, which was a conversion of the classic Bubsy game from the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, and did that for the Jaguar. After work traditional gaming companies, I did start working for a toy company and working in the electronic game division, kind of just a completely different methodology. No matter how trivial or low budget or high end making a game is, it's always kind of an intense creative process.
Game developers like you. Here's Chris DeLeon.
Thank you, Krister. Today's interview is with Faran Thomason, who's been involved with companies including Atari, Nintendo, Disney, Sega, and MGA in their games division. He's shipped over 100 successful games and consumer products over the course of his career so far. You can find him on Twitter as Jungle Cat. He's got a lot of great stories to share, and as always, I'm going to let him start off by telling us kind of his story about how he got started, and we'll go from there.
So I guess growing up, I always was kind of interested in movies. So that was kind of the direction I figured I'd go in. I attended NYU for maybe a year and a half, which was pretty cool. But NYU is fairly price prohibitive. Even in the late 80s, early 90s, it was probably, $50K a year or something. Couldn't really handle that. So I went to Michigan State University. And Michigan State was probably one of the first universities that had kind of an interactive program. Not necessarily in terms of learning programming, although those types of things were taught too, but kind of the creation of interactive media using early versions of HyperCard and things like that. So we did an interactive informational display for the school, and it used early rudimentary forms of page flipping animation. We used the Amiga with the color wheel. Some people might be familiar with that. I think it was called DigiView, where you could take pictures, and if you wanted to scan in color, you had to move this color wheel through the camera to get the, illusion of color. And then after that, moved to California and then saw ads for video game testers. I'm like, wow, you can get a job playing video games? Because obviously video games are one of those things your parents, especially during the 80s, was, it's going to rot your brain. You're never going to amount to anything. First place I interviewed was EA, but was not a Madden fan, so didn't really get that job. And then I ended up at Atari Corp as a tester for the Atari Lynx, and then moved on to the Atari Jaguar. So during that era, we're testing games like Cybermorph, Jimmy Connors Tennis, Lemmings, Malibu Beach Volleyball, Dino Dudes, and many of those games actually ended up getting kind of converted to the Atari Jaguar as well. After working as a tester, Atari was actually a great place to get started because one of the things that, say, being a tester at Atari versus Sega at the time was that we got a lot of input, arguably sometimes maybe too much input into a lot of the design elements of the game. So in games like Cybermorph, I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I even owned it for my Atari Jaguar.
Yeah, so it was one of the first free-roaming 3D shooters. So there we were the test department actually, for better or for worse, was in charge of probably designing 75 to 80% of the game. And in a massive crunch mode. So we probably had maybe half a dozen testers. And like I said, we were designing levels, play mechanics. I think even recording some of that audio that might have ended up in the game, as if memory serves, to kind of get everything together for that first launch of the Atari Jaguar. So that was cool. The upside is you got to work on a lot of different aspects of the game, from working with the developers. Some of the developers actually flew from Europe, and we kind of worked with them on site on the premises. And then some people would go to like the UK to work with the developers on the game. So that was pretty cool.
Hard for people to go from test into development, but it's cool that when you were involved with Atari, that was still a valid kind of way in.
So yeah, I would say in the early 90s, even at places like Sega, definitely that was a career path. Many of my contemporary friends that were producers, we all kind of started off in test. And the cool thing about testing back then, like I said, you had a lot of input into the games as well as interface with the producers, the artists, and the programmers. I mean, sometimes when you got into a crunch mode, you could be just sitting at the next desk with the programmer. he'd give you a rev immediately, and you'd have to document the bugs and then can it back over to him and he'd fix it. So it was a pretty hectic development cycle, a lot of long hours, people sleeping on the floor, kind of that classic Silicon Valley mythology of, people staying up late at night and fixing bugs and things like that. So I guess the first game I worked on as a producer was called Bubsy, which was a conversion of the classic Bubsy game from the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, and did that for the Jaguar. One of the downfalls, I guess you could say, of the Jaguar was that there was not a lot of software. So Atari entered into a deal with Accolade where we got all of Accolade's hits. And they gave us the source code for things like Bubsy, Hardball, which was a baseball game, Charles Barkley basketball, and a few of those kind of like late 80s, early 90s Accolade games. And so they would give us the source code, and then we'd kind of reach out, for lack of a better term, to the lowest bidder. So a lot of these coders or programmers were from the UK. And we usually use the Genesis source code because the Genesis was based on a 68,000 processor and the Jaguar was based on a 68,000 processor. I think it was probably mainly 68,000 assembler as I recall. So it made the porting a little bit easier than, say, using the Super Nintendo which I think used a different chip. And it depended on the skill of the development team. Some people would just take the art assets or the basic idea and just kind of rework it from the ground up. Some people, if things were a little bit more quick and dirty, maybe just replace the graphics and use the basic code. I mean, the unfortunate thing was that the 64-bit aspect of the Jaguar was very difficult to program because I think the programmers could only access maybe the RAM, I think, with their code in 4K increments. So you had to be very clever in terms of swapping in and out, which is why a lot of the games on the Jaguar were like ports from Amiga or Genesis, like things that used the 68,000. So you got a lot of side scrollers, and just the real hardcore hackers were the ones that could get the best out of it.
Can you say in the cases what size of kind of team, kind of how long that kind of conversion port took?
So usually back in those days, the team size was probably 1 or 2 programmers, 2 or 3 artists, a music guy or a sound effects guy, which would kind of come in at the end. And the development cycle was usually, maybe 6 months to a year, depending on the complexity of the game. Probably even standard, even as I recall, maybe for things at Sega and Nintendo that weren't like top tier, that wasn't like a Sonic or a Mario type game. So you're into about maybe an 8-month development cycle overall. No matter how trivial or low budget or high end making a game is, it's always kind of an intense creative process. And obviously from people looking outside, I think it seems like a lot of fun, but it's actually a lot of work, especially when you're dealing with a lot of external resources and just try and keep all the plates in motion as it would be to get decent to great products done on time and on schedule. So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of games that I've liked that I've worked on, but games that win awards or sell well, those are the ones I kind of tend to like the best, or the things that were original. At Nintendo, I worked on Warlock, which was probably the first handheld RTS-style game. That didn't probably get the attention that it deserved, probably too ahead of its time, and it was on the Game Boy Color, and it probably happened before people were used to playing that type of game.
Especially for mobile.
Right. Especially on a handheld game, and it was also a Western-developed game at Nintendo, so those games tended to always maybe be a little bit more second class. But still a cool game, fairly innovative, funny, had humor in it, had a lot of things going.
Some positive critical reception.
Yeah, great critical reception, just maybe a little too ahead of its time.
I'd be really curious to hear how you break it down into beginning, middle, and end. I'm particularly interested in asking you this because some of the people I talk to, they do one person or small team indie Unity kind of projects. And of course, you're coming from producer on commercial teams for a variety of consoles and handhelds.
So maybe a place like Nintendo probably could be an interesting way of describing the process. The one thing about Nintendo, and obviously it still stands today, is that like quality and originality and gameplay are probably the most important things. I worked in the Treehouse. It was probably slightly different when I was there than it is now.
And the Treehouse for people, is it a studio inside of Nintendo of America? Or?
Basically, we were the development team responsible for many of the Western-produced titles, as well as Other people were part of the localization team for the Japanese produced titles. And then we would all kind of come together to provide some form of input for all titles. And it's not to be confused with the Mario Club, which was all input for all titles. Developers, people that had kind of long-standing relationships with Nintendo from, back in the 8-bit days or Game Boy, they were usually the ones that got the highest priority, the people that had critical and financial success. So generally, people would come in, make a pitch, and then we'd give them some form of feedback. And if they came back with the feedback implemented, and they just focused on a few key game mechanics, we would kind of run it up the flagpole, see whether it was a viable product. And if everybody kind of saluted, then we would go into full bore production. And this was a case of where it would be like a second party deal, where I would be the external producer. Like I said, quality is the main thing. So really, we would focus on getting that one fun play mechanic. I'm sure you've seen it on the net. Like, you take something like Mario Brothers, you notice that first level of Mario Brothers is probably one of the best playing games ever.
Self-descriptive and simple to learn very quickly and enough going on to keep you engaged.
Exactly. So that was kind of the template, how we did things. Focus on getting that first thing up and running. Usually we would define what the game would be, define the milestones, the milestone payments. Back in the day, and I'm sure they still do it today, the bulk of the money would be weighted towards the later payments.
I understand if you can't necessarily say how Nintendo structures deals exactly, but like in my own dealing with publishers and stuff, we might do something like a 30-30-40, 30% up front, 30% at like a midpoint milestone, and 40% would be after final delivery.
Exactly.
You don't get paid all up front, you don't get paid all at the end, but if you're at some plan to spread it out.
Right. So international companies also like to keep things very simple, no matter what the scope of the project. So say it was anywhere from like a $500,000 to a $5 million deal, it still might all be broken down into 3 payment milestones, even if there were sub-milestones, just to make sure that the project was on course. Because international companies have a lot more paperwork and finance charges in terms of wiring money. So I like to keep the payment structures very simple. Whereas if it were 2 Western companies, 2 people that were, say, located in California, payment schedule might be much more granular because it's a lot more convenient to pay people in America to America rather than, say, Japan to US to the UK or some kind of combination of that.
I wrote a chapter for a French museum book about game spaces. Writing a chapter took me like a few weeks, then carried out for the next 7 or 8 months, me just trying to get paid from this French company because all the paperwork and government hassle and I hear that is much easier to deal with money within the country.
Yeah, and I think those are some of the things that, until you get into the quote business aspect of things, that people don't realize that a lot of companies have their quirks. There's like financial ramifications of sending money at certain times depending on how the dollar values against other countries' currencies. And companies that do international business have their own methodology for how they move their money around. So basically, a lot of times the developers will do something very simple just to get that first introductory milestone payment. So it could be as simple as character moving across the screen and jumping over a simple object. This just allows them to do some minimal form of work. You're seeing they're doing work and they get paid.
It's evidence they've got something running on platform.
Exactly. So if you're on the developer side and you have to manage 20 people through a fluctuating amount of projects, you have to decide how people are allocated to the project that's most efficient to you in terms of keeping your clients happy, as well as keeping people paid and keeping everybody busy. That's also something that both sides kind of feel each other out for. Are they putting the amount of people they committed on the project? So many times that means you kind of have to go on the premises of the developer and kind of work side by side to make sure that A, they're giving you the support that they need, and vice versa. Kind of walk before you run, get things up and running. And then you get like a first prototype, first playable, which could be more refined, but still very rudimentary. And then, move to your typical alpha, beta, and then release kind of schedule.
Kind of scrolling back through your very long list of games you worked on, so people can maybe better visualize how this might connect to some of these games. A lot of them are Game Boy Color, Bionic Commando Elite Forces, Warlocked, Alice in Wonderland, Little Mermaid 2 Pinball, Crystalis, R-Type DX, Disney Magical Quest starring Mickey and Minnie, Pocket Soccer. So it's been through a lot of cycles on a lot of different games that this kind of process is reflecting. And it's not like a one-off of like, here's how one particular game happened to happen. it's like there's a process here.
Exactly. And you know what? They're all kind of different. Some things like Warlock was a great idea. The developer had refined that basic RTS mechanic of getting the pathfinding down, etc. And we just knew it was something we had to do. Whereas all those Disney titles, those were kind of mandated out of a bigger partnership that Disney and Nintendo had. There was literally a list of maybe half a dozen or a dozen games that were kind of contractually mandated. And that was a broader partnership with Disney. And then the things like Bionic Commando, for example, those were projects that were done by NST, which was a division of Nintendo. And I think it was a joint venture between Nintendo and Digipen, as I recall.
Oh, interesting.
So that was on the basic premises of Nintendo in Redmond. So that was all developed, not quite in-house. They weren't part of the treehouse.
Back in that time, wasn't Digipen like in the same building? Shared a parking lot at least.
Shared parking lot and in the same building as NST. So it was kind of the training grounds for up-and-coming programmers, artists, etc. And then, I guess, moving to like kind of the toy industry, creating electronic games for that is kind of just a completely different methodology. So in video games, if for better or for worse, back in that era, there was definitely a wall between, say, marketing and product development, which I think kind of hurt, I would say, the creative people. This is just my opinion. So by not embracing the marketing department, say in the 90s and up to like maybe the early to mid 2000s, it allowed the people that were very much into the internet marketing, direct marketing, and had a lot of marketing theory to come in and kind of revolutionize video games once it hit mobile. Those are the people that were best in place to execute and monetize their products. Whereas older school people that kind of poo-pooed marketing, I think it kind of put them into a backseat.
I know internally with bigger studio, we would have people in marketing. Their feeling was like marketing should be much more involved in the design of the games. Meanwhile, we'd have game designers who found that idea like infuriating. And then sure enough, as payment models have shifted in the past few years to prioritizing whether in-app transactions or free-to-play social games, subscription-based games, etc., the companies that are willing to adapt to that and consider that and have it in mind for their games, I think have certainly been reaping rewards from doing so.
Exactly. And so at some point after working traditional gaming companies, I did start working for a toy company and working in their electronic game division. And there, all the products we made were pretty much based on how many orders could we get from Walmart, Target, and Toys R Us.
Kind of knew ahead of time which position you're filling in a slot for.
If Walmart didn't salute, they didn't give us a good feeling of a pre-order for the game or the product or whatever we're making, we just never made it.
For anyone listening who may not be clear on electronic games, certainly I grew up playing plenty of, but I don't know how much they're kind of still in the limelight for people who are video game developers. But talking anything from like 3-in-1 Texas Hold'em, kind of the handheld LCD screens, some handheld adaptations of Bejeweled, of Pac-Man, Space Invaders, as well as looks like you've worked on some Bratz properties as well.
Right. So yeah, I was there when the Bratz were riding high, and we could kind of put the Bratz logos and characters on almost anything.
It was like a dance kind of game with Bratz. There's a tennis game with Bratz. There's a Rockstar game with Bratz.
Yeah, so we would take dance games. They were kind of low-hanging fruit. We probably made 3 or 4 different iterations of dance mats. Sometimes we'd actually use some people that had programmed games for, say, Nintendo or Sega or any of their kind of third parties to make a lot of these games. So there was, during that TV plug-and-play era, people that were definitely good at sprite-based games saw a lot of success in the creation of kind of these lower-end TV games because the system architecture of those chips were kind of based on 8-bit Nintendos or 16-bit Nintendos, etc. So they could apply their old technology as well as their techniques for generating art and programming to these new devices.
Fascinating.
We did a lot of different types of things. I mean, MGA was cool because you got to actually see, as I say, how the sausage is made for consumer products. You got to run the gamut from like going to the factories in China, seeing how products are physically made, to seeing how products are sold to places like Walmart, why certain products get featured on the shelf, TV advertising, all the aspects that consumers really don't see on how a product arrives from the germ of an idea to ending up on a retail shelf.
And not just that consumers don't, even modern game developers who in many cases take for granted that they kind of approach it as my job is to build software and it'll be sold over the internet or it'll be sold in the app store. Someone's going to pay to download my thing. as opposed to, it's not like the retail market cease existing. Like Walmart's still huge, and so many people still, their experience with games and toys, and as they walk through the stores, they find stuff on the shelves. And there's still a certain process that all this stuff has to go through to get built and distributed. And it's kind of a fascinating in the business I don't get to hear as much about.
Yeah, so one of the things that people don't realize, especially from a retail perspective, is how important packaging is. At a place like MGA, one could argue that packaging and the creation of how the product sits in the package, how the package is constructed, and how durable the package is easily 30% of the process. Because in many cases, that was your advertisement. So if you could create a unique package and have it sit on the shelf in some kind of clever or unique way, or find a way of displaying what's inside the package in a clever way, that would actually go a long way.
It's not just a container for the thing. It's got a lot of personality to it and a lot of variety.
Yeah. So one of the other things is like you could refresh. Obviously, in the world of app development, you can monitor your analytics and see if you're going down. And then you're like, okay, let's go and try to shine up the app a little bit more, add a new feature, take away a feature, etc., to try to get more eyeballs and more downloads.
I remember Nintendo would just release their consoles in different colors. For Game Boy and for N64, that was a pretty substantial bump of... I'd already decided to not buy an N64, but that was the old gray and black one. I don't know about... Maybe I do need a blue one.
Yep. So we would do the same type of thing. If we got a heated call from Walmart that says, the color blue just really isn't killing it on retail, we would get on the phone as soon as humanly possible, come up with like another iteration of the product. Sometimes we'd retool, sometimes we'd change the package, sometimes it would be the color. And so we would actually kind of do all those things at retail too, to always keep the product fresh and updated. If something was kind of an evergreen hot product, we would just change maybe the color of the packaging from different season to seasons. We have a spring selling season and a winter selling season. When you're a marketing run company, you kind of take all those aspects into consideration. The unfortunate part, I would say, is sometimes, yes, the quality of the actual product suffered, but our price points were too low that as long as the product was selling, people kind of looked the other way.
That strategy of having like a seasonal change in how you present something. I mean, there's no reason why app developers can't be changing their icons certain times or changing their sales presentation in the same kind of way to explore like maybe the problems their packaging or timing or needs to be refreshed.
Exactly. And obviously there's a lot online about, how to make the perfect icon for your app. And I assume those things change constantly. I would say the kind of the one quirk from packaged goods to online is that constant iteration and refinement and kind of keeping up with what's hot trends of why, or maybe you can't really even figure out why. That's probably always a mystery. But the fact that people are doing X instead of Y now, and maybe you need to change it to X to kind of keep current and keep your product fresh.
Well, it's so hard because as soon as somebody gets the formula of here's what works like right now, and that means everyone else can do it, and suddenly everyone's doing it, now it looks plain, and that's last year's thing. And next year it's something different.
Yep. Back in the 90s and 80s, you had a lot of garage people creating games, and then once the PS1, PS2 era hit, you couldn't really do that. And now you're kind of back to the garage era of games, but the bar has dropped even lower. So now almost anybody can make a game or an app. And so I would say the real battle for everything is definitely learning the marketing and learning the analytics. Not that I'm a huge fan of that, but those are the most important things I think for anybody to learn and understand how that process works. It's super competitive, and even the big guys don't even understand how all of this works. So anything you can do to kind of gain a competitive advantage is definitely, I think, something you got to learn, especially in the marketing.
Now, I'd like to pull at least a few questions from Twitter follower folks out there. One's Andrew DeRizio. That's iCarbon's Andrew on Twitter. He's asking, what's best advice for collaborating with others? Do you have advice for people as far as working more effectively with others, cooperating?
Yeah, I think maybe upfront get an agreement of what everybody's responsibilities and tasks are. Doesn't mean that there can't be some overlap. But I think definitely 110% understanding of what people are responsible for is probably the most crucial thing. And then getting a good simultaneous buy-off in terms of the product vision. I mean, obviously, if there's a reasonable amount of money involved, I think it's typically easier to get those kinds of things because you'll have a contract in place, and that contract will usually define the expectations of both parties in writing. So there's some form of protection as well as money to kind of keep the grease within the engine, and there's an obvious commercial benefit. But if you're trying things from more of an indie, I think you do have the luxury of experimenting with different types of people and different parts of the world and different methodologies and with very little financial repercussions on your end. And you can use that as a learning process. But obviously, I would say the most crucial thing, as I said before, is just try to get an expectation of what everybody's going to do and what the end process should be, and then communicate.
It's a really good point that you bring up. It seems like a lot of the frustrations people run into with collaborating is either something falling through the cracks and people get mad at each other of like, why didn't that get done? Or people step on each other's toes of, we both did the same thing this week. Now somebody's stuff isn't going to count or can't be integrated together, or certainly at the small scale, that stuff happens all the time.
Exactly. So there is possibly some need even on small projects for a producer/project manager kind of role.
At least somebody wearing that hat.
Or somebody wearing that hat. Somebody that is tasked with that role, be it even if that is a multi-role position. But somebody's got to keep the trains running on time. And since there's so many tools for management, as well as for every aspect of the creation of any kind of creative venture these days, and they can all link together now relatively well, there's kind of no excuse for that these days.
Gotcha. I think that makes good sense. And now also, I want to make sure we address, too, that you've been doing large-scale commercial stuff professionally for a long time, but you've also more recently been making some apps on your own?
Yeah. The first apps I did were probably maybe 2009 or 10, and these were promotional apps for video game companies. It was just kind of a good way to get the feet wet in the iOS world, although so much has changed since then. They seem so quaint, for lack of a better word.
And the game was Darksiders that it was promotional for, right? And Weapons of War?
Yeah, to kind of hype and promote Darksiders, THQ was like, we've got some money, not a ton of money. Give us as many kind of promotional ideas to help us market this game as you can. So that was kind of cool, working in kind of the promotional end of things. We got to do some iOS as well as some Facebook. So it was cool to kind of dip my toe into that world early on. And most recently, I've done kind of my own personal projects, mainly on Android. At the moment, I kind of like Android because you can iterate relatively quickly without approval. One note I will say, the first app I did was a little edgy. It was a twerking app, and Google is actually doing a slightly better job of vetting, quote, mature content these days. But that being said, because of the open source nature of Android, there are many third, fourth party repositories or whatever you want to call it.
Other ways to distribute the game.
Yeah, there's many ways to distribute your product. Not saying that they're going to reach a jillion people, but it means you always have options on Android as opposed to iOS.
Right. Question about that decision to go Android before iOS. One of the things that early on, I was doing mobile games also 2008, 2010 kind of era, that appealed to me about iOS versus Android was that the device was, at least at the time, so much less fragmented. There was only a few different screen resolutions or screen sizes. Even just processor capabilities were at least comparable. So if I could make it work on like a third generation such and such on a reasonably new OS, I knew it would still work on these other devices. My friends who were doing Android, I feel like they were having all kinds of challenges of there's some really low-end Android devices and there's some really high-resolution, bigger Android devices. And was that anything you found troubles with, or because of the format of the game or technology platform you used wasn't really part of the hassle?
Honestly, it was one of those things that I knew was out there, but I couldn't really let it deter me because you're just never going to be 100%. And at the moment, I'm trying to keep my costs super low. So it's not really that big of a deal. I think as you're moving up the ladder, you're obviously going to have to be far more conscious of that.
Gotcha. And I know, that same fragmentation issue, I mentioned it, and also the ability to go from Android to iOS is one reason why a lot of developers have been gravitating towards platform choices like Unity. Is there a certain backend technology you all are using will help you in porting to different platforms, or is it kind of right now, coded in Java straight for Android only at the moment?
For, I would say, my personal or hobby projects, just sticking with Android, but I would definitely, in this day and age, recommend something like Unity because it's accessible. A lot of people are using it. That's going to be your best bang for your buck. One upcoming project that I'm working on, going to be using probably a homegrown engine, but I think that engine's multi-platform. I think if you came up through the ranks in the 90s or 2000, you still might have a personal bias towards kind of making your own engine, but I don't think that there's really any valid reason that everybody needs to do that anymore. Like processing speed, memories so fast and cheap that I think the Unities and the multi-platform engines of the world are pretty good.
Hopefully going getting better every year.
Oh, right. Or every week.
And now, as somebody who's been doing this for a while, do you have some advice, some tips, some motivation for people who are thinking about it, who are trying to figure out if they can make a career of it, or if it's just something they might like doing?
The technology is out there. Get started now. If you want to make a game, an app, a book, a movie, any kind of creative endeavor, the tools are out there, so the bar is pretty low to get your feet wet and to get moving. There's tons of e-courses out there, tons of software, tons of forums for collaboration. So if you have a creative idea, there's very little reason why you shouldn't be executing it in some way, shape, or form. And it's just a matter of kind of getting off your butt and getting moving. There's enough information out there on how to make any kind of game.
It's a really good way of putting it. You just need to start doing it.
Exactly. And I would say start simple. There's no reason to make a mass effect killer for your first thing. Walk, then you can run and kind of move up the ladder.
Thanks so much for taking the time to chat.
Oh yeah, no problem. It was great.
Have a good one.
Thanks a lot. You too.
Faran mentioned the importance of just getting started on building something simple when you do. And of course, that's something that I'm all about in my work with Gamkedo. I encourage you to check out, there's a completely free video course to help you get over making your very first game at Gamkedo.com. That's GAMKEDO.com. Go check it out. Like literally tonight, you can have finished programming your first game. You don't need any special software. You don't need to download or install anything. All you need is a text editor and a web browser. I'm going to walk you through writing your first game so that by tomorrow, you'll be a game developer. Gamkedo.com, GAMKEDO.com. Free video course. Only takes a few hours. Also, if you're in the Los Angeles area and would like to meet up, this coming Saturday, September 12th, 2015, at 6 p.m., Indie Dev Club in Santa Monica, California will be having a meetup where I'll be the guest speaker. I'll be speaking about my mobile game experiences on published games, independent games, a few hybrid contract work projects done in between, a lot of things about that space and my learnings from my years doing that. So if you're interested in meeting up, see me in person. We only have about 10 slots left. I think the first 40 are already filled so far. So check it out. Google for meetup.com's Indie Dev Club meetup group. Come join us on Saturday, September 12th, 2015, where I'll be the guest speaker on mobile game development. And then lastly, I want to give a quick shout out to Lanthos, developer I've had the privilege of working with, for his 5-star written review on iTunes, as well as to an iTunes user who identifies as Indie Game Dev is their username. So unfortunately, I can't be any more specific, but thanks to Indie Game Dev as well for the 5-star written review on iTunes. Like I say, really appreciate it. Really helps us out a lot here at the podcast, Game Developers Like You. Tune in next week for a new episode, but with a new interview. Music at the start and end of this podcast is provided by Danny Baranowski, used with permission.